The most dangerous decisions we can make are not the impulsive decisions. I actually believe that the most dangerous decisions we can make can come from a result of our doubt. Because if we allow our doubt to control our decision making, if we let doubt dictate the direction of our lives, we will opt for shortcuts, we will compromise in what we believe, and even more so, we'll move away from God's good plans and purposes that He has in store for our lives. Doubt, so that we're all on the same page, is simply put a feeling of uncertainty. Doubt is not the antithesis to faith. Faith is unbelief, but doubt, that would be unbelief, but doubt can be difficult to overcome. These feelings of uncertainty. And if we let them dictate the direction of our lives, we might miss out on the greater plans that God has in store for our lives. Doubt is easy for us to fall into, but it can be really hard for us to get out of. And we often have questions circulating around doubt that can easily intrude into our minds. It can be easy for us to question if God is actually going to come through in whatever circumstance we find ourselves in. So then today, as we explore these questions around doubt, we're going to be landing around here. How do we remain steadfast in our faith when we experience doubt? When we find ourselves wrestling and questioning if God is going to come through for us? And as we jump into our word today, we are continuing in our series called Overcome. And we're looking at the story of Joseph from Genesis, the first book in the Bible. And we've been looking at Joseph, talking about him, and he is a man who has had every reason to doubt God. At this point in his story, Joseph has endured many years of hardship. He was betrayed by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was falsely accused when he did nothing wrong. He was forgotten while he was in prison. So I can imagine it must have been really hard for him to believe that deliverance would ever come for him. I can imagine he wrestled with an overwhelming amount of doubt. Would God really come through for him and fulfill the dream that He gave him when he was only 17 years old? That dream where God told him that he would be raised up to a position of influence. Would that ever come about for him? I'm sure he was wrestling with some doubt. And I know that we've experienced hardships in our lives. And it can be also easy for us to succumb to doubt, to think that God will not come through for us. But Joseph's story, as we look at today, it's going to teach us how we can overcome doubt as those thoughts start to penetrate into our mind. And what we're going to see is that we can overcome doubt by remaining obedient to God's timing rather than our own, and trusting that He is always at work even when we may not be able to see it. We're going to also see that we can overcome these thoughts of doubt when we remain confident that we don't have to persuade when we proclaim God's truths. And we're also going to see that we can overcome doubt when we remain free to give our best to others because we know and trust that God has our back. And so today, our text is going to be in the book of Genesis, specifically in chapter 41, starting at verse 1. If you brought your Bibles, I encourage you to turn there with me. We're going to read it in just a moment together. But as we pick up Joseph's story this morning, let me remind you of where we left off last week. He has been placed in prison unjustly, and he's continued to act with integrity during his stay in prison. And while he was there, Joseph continued to receive God's blessing, and he shared that blessing with two other inmates who had dreams that had them troubled because they didn't know what they meant. And Joseph was able to share God's interpretation of those dreams, and they eventually came to pass. However, Joseph asked that he would be remembered when they came to pass, and he was forgotten. He continued to remain in prison, and that's where we are picking up our text this morning in verse 1 of chapter 41. And it says this: When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled. So he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me. And the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard, each of us had a dream that night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there. He was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh." As our chapter began this morning, we found Joseph still in prison. And the text says that it was another 2 full years that had passed since he was forgotten by one of his inmates. Now, could you imagine? Joseph has been through some hardship. And I can imagine his hope at this point was wearing really thin. I'm sure during those passing years, he was doubting if God would ever come through for him, if he would ever deliver him. And then Pharaoh has a dream. In fact, he's given 2 dreams, and he's puzzled by what they mean. And the text says that he had no one around him that was able to interpret them for him. And we talked in previous weeks about the importance of dreams, especially in the ancient Near East. But just to remind you, dreams were understood as a method in which the divine would communicate with humanity. So dreams were very important in this ancient culture back then. So the fact that Pharaoh was given 2 dreams means that there's something really important that these deities want to communicate to Pharaoh. The fact that they gave him a set, it means that the dreams weren't random, they were actually reliable. And these dreams that were given to Pharaoh show that there is something that he really needs to know. But in verse 8, the text tells us, Pharaoh's mind was troubled because he could not interpret them, and no one around him was able to interpret them. And this is a really bad sign for Pharaoh, who's the leader of this Egyptian nation, because Pharaoh himself, in that culture, he was considered to be partially divine. So if he wasn't able to understand what these deities were supposed to be communicating to him, and he needed to seek a dream specialist, this meant that the situation was really, really bad for him. It was really bad. However, the cupbearer finally speaks up. After 2 years since being let out of prison, he had forgotten about Joseph. He can't even recall his name. He calls him a young Hebrew man because he can't even remember who Joseph was. But suddenly, with these unique circumstances, he's reminded of what happened to him. I too received a dream. I too was troubled. And there was a young man who was able to help me understand what these dreams meant. So Pharaoh went and fetched for this young man and presented him before him. Now, in this situation, this is a really, really unique situation that Joseph finds himself in. And I think it would have been so easy for him to get caught up in his doubt. Maybe thinking to himself, am I ever going to be given the opportunity to be released? He's been forgotten about for 2 full years. It could have been so easy for skepticism to creep in, to doubt God. God, you probably aren't going to come through for me. Every situation I've been in has panned out like a disaster. I can't see how you're going to come through this time. But Joseph waited in 2 years. But this delay was not wasted, was it? As we read this text, we saw that while Joseph was waiting in prison, God was preparing. He was preparing Pharaoh's heart to be ready to listen. And oftentimes, I think we assume that when we are waiting, it means that God is inactive. That if we don't see any movement, then God must be done writing our story. But what we witness as we read this portion of the text this morning is that this story shows us that God is always working even if we do not see it. And we oftentimes fall into this mindset where we think God hasn't shown up yet, so he probably never will. Last night, my family and I were driving home from a birthday party. And we had a great time, and the kids had a blast. And they played this fun game where they had a saran wrap ball full of prizes, and they had to unwrap it. And it was a lot of fun as my son got a goodie bag and he was stuffing it full of all the prizes that he got. And he was so excited by the things that he got. He hadn't had time to explore them because he was so busy running around, eating cake, doing all the fun things you do at a children's birthday party. So he hands me the bag and I'm holding it. And we get into the car to leave and I set it down in the front console. He gets in, he buckles up in the car seat, and all he wants to do is get his bag of gifts and open them right away. But his mom and I, we know that if he were to dive into that bag of gifts, he wouldn't be able to reach the full potential of playing with them because a lot of them had small little pieces. And when he's buckled into a car seat, he can't explore them and have the fun that he would want to. So we had him wait for the drive home. And that was so difficult for him because he just wants to open them right away, not understanding that some things, like small toys with small pieces, are better to enjoy in the proper setting. What if God's blessings were like that? He has good things prepared for you. He's got this bag lined up for you. He has good things in store he wants to give to you. He's just waiting for the right moment. He's not trying to withhold them from you. He's just trying to make sure you receive them in the best way possible. You see, God is always working in our waiting. And even when we can't see it, God is preparing hearts. He's aligning circumstances. He's setting up the stage to accomplish his greater purposes. So do a bit of self-reflection. Are you willing to trust God even when you're not seeing him move? Even when it's not evident? What if the delays were about more than just your story? What if there was more going on that God was at work doing? What if God was aligning things beyond what you could perceive? You see, I think oftentimes we wrestle with this doubt around God's timing, not sure when he's going to act. But I want us to remain obedient in those seasons. It requires us to trust that God is always at work, even when we may have to wait. So here in the story, Joseph is presented before Pharaoh, and let's see if this is his opportune moment to show him who he is and receive a position of influence. Picking up the text in verse 15, it says this. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered, and thin, and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. In verse 15, Pharaoh speaks to Joseph. He tells him that he has heard that he is the one who can finally interpret his dream. Now imagine for a moment that you're in Joseph's shoes. Put yourself in his place for a moment. You just got brought out from the dungeon, and you're now being brought before Pharaoh's throne. This may have been the first time you've gotten a shower, a shave, and a fresh set of clothes in years. And now you hear that your reputation as a dream interpreter has now risen to one of the most powerful mans in the nation. And he asks you a question. So I hear you interpret dreams, don't you? I have a dream I can't interpret. Do you think you can interpret it for me? what would you say back in that situation? Because the reply that comes in my mind is not the one that Joseph gives in verse 16, is it? I would probably never say what Joseph said because he blurts out, I cannot do it. What are you thinking, Joseph? Why on earth would you answer that way? Maybe you could just spin your answer to where you can still give God some of the credit, but where you're not like on the chopping block here. But Joseph recovers, and he says, I cannot, but God can give you the answer you are looking for. And I love Joseph's character throughout the entire narrative this far. It's been one of pure motives, one of faithfulness, one of loyalty, one of integrity. And it continues through this passage as well, because he takes no credit for himself. He continues to point to God's power and not his own. And Joseph is very intentional with his words here. He promises Pharaoh that God will give him the answer that he desires, but he doesn't guarantee that the answer would be favorable. He says, God will grant you an answer. It'll relieve you from anxiety and from your troubled mind, even if it's not the answer you were hoping for, Pharaoh. And we know back then how important the dreams were, but oftentimes the dream interpretation that was given by the Egyptian magicians was done so in a way that would give the king a favorable outcome. They were more concerned about pleasing the king's ears than actually being faithful to the message of the dream. Joseph, however, is in stark contrast to that, because he tells Pharaoh the dream, but he doesn't soften the message. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He cares only about presenting the truth of it to Pharaoh. And after Pharaoh tells him the dream, Joseph then gives him the interpretation that God placed on his heart. And he holds nothing back. He gives him both the good, he gives him both the bad. Joseph tells him that his dream was a prediction of the next 14 years that are going to pass. The first 7 years will be in abundance like they've never seen before in Egypt, but the next 7 will be the most severe famine, like nothing you've ever experienced in Egypt so far. Joseph says this prediction is certain and is going to come, and it's going to come soon. Pharaoh was right to be troubled by the dreams he received, because these dreams are powerful. Egypt was a unique nation back then because it didn't depend on seasonal rainfall to grow its crops. It had the Nile River, and it was a source of life for them. They worshiped the Nile god, the Nile as a god. It had a dependable schedule in which it would flood. So their country, it never had to experience what other countries may have, where they experienced an extended season of drought or famine where they're dependent on the rainfall, because they had this consistent and dependable Nile River. And gods were often associated with the flooding of the Nile River. So for Joseph's God to now have sent a dream to a foreign nation, saying that I will bring drought in what your gods were in control, is showing the magnitude of Joseph's God who he worships. Do you see what I'm talking about? The gods of the Nile were the ones who would give them life, and now here's this God of the Hebrews who can rip all of that away because he is so powerful. This God quite literally could bring an end to the Egyptian empire as they knew it. So what on earth would Pharaoh do? Who would save them from the imminent destruction? And again, what I love about the story is Joseph's persistent integrity. He's yet again faced with a unique challenge in this situation, isn't he? Because when kings were given interpretations that were unfavorable, one like this, where another foreign nation's God is going to wipe out your existence, the king, upon hearing this interpretation, could have very well have Joseph killed on the spot because his interpretation was so offensive to him. And Joseph, he would have known this. There would have been a reputation around this, but despite his own life being at risk, he chose to remain obedient to God's truth. Joseph speaks God's truth, not what Pharaoh might have wanted to hear. He doesn't at all soften God's message. Because if Joseph, in the situation that he was dealt, if he doubted God's protection, if he doubted God's ability to sustain his life, he could have done two things in the situation. The first one he could have done is he couldn't take credit for the interpreting power that he possessed. He could have claimed it right there on the spot, become risen to a high position in Pharaoh's palace as being his dream interpreter. And he could have given, his second thing he could have done is given Pharaoh a favorable message. And that would have secured him a position as an interpreter in the court. It would have been so easy for Joseph to let those doubt thoughts creep in and direct his life in a certain direction, wondering, what would happen if I just took the credit here? What could my future look like if I were to tell Pharaoh something positive about his outcome? Maybe I could secure something better than the dungeon I have been living in. You can see how easily doubt could have crept into his mind and led and directed Joseph to an act of self-preservation. But Joseph resists. He doesn't succumb to his doubt. He remained faithful. And he gave God the credit, and he stewarded God's message with integrity, even when speaking the truth could have literally cost him his life. Now, this is what true faith looks like: denying yourself and giving God the credit and being a faithful steward of his message. Now, I think we see examples of the opposite in culture all of the time. And one of the examples from history that came to my mind was the rivalry between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. Edison is often credited as pioneering the modern electrical system, but much of the actual innovation behind the alternating current electricity actually came from Tesla. Rather than acknowledging Tesla's work, Edison actually worked really hard to discredit him. He spread misinformation about AC electricity to maintain his own influence. He took credit where credit wasn't due, and he manipulated the narrative for his own benefit. And this is one example, but we can see this all over our world that we live in today, don't we? And we can easily start to get trapped into this way of thinking and start to act in this way where self-preservation matters more to us, self-promotion matters more to us, because we're worried about what the future outcome might hold, and we want the control in our hands. But when standing before Pharaoh, Joseph, he had a golden opportunity to take the credit for himself. He could have used this moment to elevate his own status, secure his future, but instead he remained faithful. He pointed to God as his true source of wisdom, no matter what the results may be. So when God gives you influence, when God gives you an opportunity, how do you respond? When God gives you influence, when God gives you opportunity, do you use them to point people to him, to give him the glory? Or do you seek to elevate yourself? See, because I believe we can overcome the pressures of doubt not by grasping for power, not by reaching for recognition, but by trusting that God is in control and remaining faithful to him no matter the circumstances that come our way. Joseph, he remained a faithful steward of God's message, but he didn't leave Pharaoh there either. He has more he wants to say, and he wants to give him some wisdom and some insights to help him deal with the dilemma that he has been handed. So picking up the text in verse 33, let's see what else Joseph has to say. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials, so Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" You see, Joseph, he doesn't leave Pharaoh with the bad news of imminent famine, imminent destruction. Instead, he shares his wisdom in order to help him move forward in a positive way. I can imagine for Joseph, who has been through so much in his time in Egypt, who's been falsely imprisoned for years, he could have had that bitterness and that resentment boil up, and he could have let this nation be destroyed. But instead, he decided to share God's wisdom so that the nation could be spared. Joseph shows himself to be really quick on his feet and careful in his actions, and he gives them a plan that would actually further the prosperity of this nation rather than destroy it. He proposes a 20% tax, and that tax would be stored for later. And now, when the famine comes, the government could actually sell that food back to the people who gave it to them. So it's no surprise that Pharaoh likes this. He says, this is a great way we should go. Thank you for this information. And what I love about this is how it ends in Pharaoh's response. Because he responds by asking, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Because that's Pharaoh's recognition that this wasn't just any man. This was a man that had God's Spirit within him. It wasn't his own human wisdom. He was dependent upon the Lord's direction. And that's what made him so wise. That's what made him so intelligent. And that's what made him so integral through the situation. It was that God's Spirit was resting on him. This section of the story not only highlights Joseph's wisdom, but his trust in God. Because Joseph didn't withhold that information. He could have easily said, if you promote me, if you secure me a position, then I will give you information on how you can get through this famine. But he didn't do that. Joseph didn't angle for power the entire time. He spoke with wisdom, and he gave it freely to those who needed it. It would have been so easy for Joseph to get caught up in his doubt. Am I going to be given a great opportunity? So let me restrain the wisdom that God has given me so that I can use it for my own benefit. But he didn't do that. He gave it freely. He acted in good faith, knowing that God will take care of him regardless of what Pharaoh does. He knew he didn't have to secure his spot by his own will. He knows that God will take care of him as long as he continues to put his faith in him. Joseph's character is beautiful. It's such an inspiration for us today. But his character, it wasn't made in an instant. He wasn't just blessed with this. Because Joseph's story, as we've been reading it, has a lot of ups and downs, doesn't it? Mostly downs so far. But God has been hard at work throughout his story, shaping his character and preparing him for the very important role that he is playing in God's story. Oftentimes, when I think about my own faith journey and the things I have walked through, I would have rather skipped over certain seasons of my life and gotten to the avenues of promotion, avenues of blessing. I would have rather jumped to the promotion scene and skip the pit, skip the prison. But God was working in all of that to mold and shape Joseph in specific ways. There's this lovely illustration of God being a master painter, and we are his masterpiece. You've probably heard something like that before. I think it's beautiful to see how God is the master painter, and he has all of the things. He's putting him into perspective, into proportion to create this beautiful masterpiece. And I think that's great and it's lovely. But I don't think it wrestles with the difficulty that we have to go through with life very well. So I think the better analogy would actually be that God is a sculptor, and we are a block of marble. In one hand, God has a chisel, and the other hand, a hammer. He knows exactly where he needs to hit and chip away in order to turn us into a great masterpiece. He uses the hardships, he uses the trials, he uses the brokenness that we have to walk through in order to form us into a beautiful image that he knows is underneath that marble. So just as Joseph's hardships shaped him into a leader, God also wants to shape you through the seasons of waiting, through seasons of difficulty, through the seasons that are really big trials for you. I know I've had to walk through that in different ways, and I know you have as well. And rather than succumb to frustration, rather than succumb to resentment, let's view them as opportunities to continue to press in to what God wants to do. Because I know that he has a beautiful plan in store, even if it takes you going through that waiting and that difficulty. Just in the same way, when you want to build muscle, you have to first tear them. Muscles grow under strain. So does our faith deepen through our waiting and through our trials. So I want you to think about, what are the struggles in your life right now that God might be using to shape you? Because those are unique. And God is going to use them to continue to mold and shape you as he has you on the path towards the greater plans that we don't even know what they are yet. Joseph, he was able to overcome his doubt in this situation. He remained free to give his best because he knew that all along God had his back. God was going to take care of him, and God was ultimately in charge. So for you and me, When we are walking through difficulty, when we are walking through our trials, we should focus on what God is trying to do in the right here and now. Not the what can I get to, what is the promotion that is coming. Don't focus on the blessing, focus on God's presence as he is with you through your current circumstances. Lean in to how God is molding you, shaping you, and refining you. Joseph's story is one where he has undergone a lot of difficulty, a lot of hardship, but God is orchestrating all of it to accomplish his good plans and purposes. It would have been so easy in multiple scenarios for Joseph to have just given up, to let his doubt control his thoughts and dictate the direction that his life would take, but instead, he chose to hold on to God's goodness and trust him in every circumstance. And we'll see as we continue reading that God is going to use it for good. Joseph displayed a posture of faithfulness to wherever God's plans took him. He remained obedient to God's timing, faithful to his message. He was integral in everything that he did. So then, how do we remain steadfast in our faith when we experience doubt? When we question if God is going to come through? We need to not let doubt dictate our direction. And we need to remain faithful to where God is leading us. So for a moment, I want you just to reflect. Are you letting doubt dictate the direction of your life? Because all of us at some point in our lives, we're going to have to wrestle with these questions of doubt. Doubt is going to creep into our minds somehow, and we need to continue to resonate with the ways that God might be calling us to be faithful to him rather than our own plans. So I want you to think about and identify a key area where we may be tempted to go about it your own way rather than rely and trust on God. Where you are letting your doubt dictate your next step, and how instead God might be offering you an opportunity to be faithful to him, his direction, his timing, his plans for your life.